August 4th, 1945. The Second World War is in its final days. In Moscow, the mood is jubilant. The Soviet Union and the United States are allies, victors standing over the ruins of Nazi Germany. To celebrate this historic friendship, the Soviet Young Pioneer Organization, essentially the Soviet Boy Scouts, presents a gift to the United States Ambassador, Averell Harriman. It is a beautiful gesture. A group of smiling Soviet children enters the U.S. ambassador's residence, the Spaso House. They are carrying a massive, hand-carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States. It is a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The bald eagle, the olive branch, the arrows, the shield, every detail is carved from the finest exotic woods, boxwood, magnolia, Persian walnut. Ambassador Harriman is touched. He examines the gift. It looks innocent. It feels solid. It is a symbol of peace between two superpowers. He decides to hang it in the most prestigious place in the embassy, right over his desk in his private study. For the next 7 years, that wooden eagle hung on the wall. It witnessed everything. It hung there while the alliance crumbled. It hung there while the Iron Curtain fell across Europe. It hung there while the Korean War began. It hung there while the U.S. developed the hydrogen bomb. Under the watchful eye of that eagle, 4 different American ambassadors, Harriman, Walter Bedell Smith, Alan Kirk, and George Kennan, discussed the most sensitive secrets of the United States. They strategized about Stalin, they planned covert operations, they dictated top-secret cables to Washington, and the Soviets heard every single word. They heard the scratch of the pen on paper, they heard the clinking of ice in whiskey glasses, they heard the whispers of diplomats. Because inside that beautiful wooden carving was the most sophisticated, undetectable, and genius listening device ever created. They called it The Thing. Welcome to the Shadow Dossier. Today we declassify the story of the Great Seal bug, the device that humiliated American intelligence and proved that the most dangerous weapon in the Cold War wasn't a bomb, but a wooden carving. To understand the brilliance of this device, we have to look at the limitations of 1940s technology. In 1945, bugging a room was difficult. Microphones were large. They needed wires. They needed batteries. If you wanted to bug an embassy, you had to drill holes in the walls to run cables, or you had to bribe a cleaner to replace batteries every few days. Batteries die. Wires can be found with metal detectors. Electronic components emit heat and radio signals that can be swept. The Soviets knew that the Americans regularly swept the Spaso house for bugs. The U.S. security teams were thorough. They checked for wires, they checked for radio signals, they checked for power sources. So the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, turned to a man who was not a spy but a magician of physics, Leon Theremin. You might know Theremin as the inventor of the musical instrument that bears his name, the spooky, wailing instrument used in sci-fi movie soundtracks. But Theremin was also a genius inventor, imprisoned in a secret Soviet laboratory, a sharashka forced to work for Stalin. Stalin gave him a problem. Build me a microphone that has no batteries, no wires, no electronics, and is impossible to detect. It sounded impossible. But Theremin found a solution in the principles of resonance and radio waves. He designed a device that was deceptively simple. It consisted of a small copper cylinder, a metal membrane, and an antenna. That's it. There were no active electronic components, no vacuum tubes, no transistors, no power source. It sat inside the wooden seal, completely inert. It was a passive device. If you scanned the room with a bug detector, the device would be silent. It was dead. But it could be brought to life from the outside. Here is how it worked. The Soviets set up a listening post in a van parked outside the embassy or in a nearby apartment building. When they wanted to listen to the ambassador, they aimed a powerful radio beam at the Spaso house. This radio beam, operating at a specific frequency, around 330 megahertz, would pass through the walls and hit the antenna inside the wooden eagle. The energy from the radio beam would wake up the device. It would energize the copper cavity. The metal membrane inside the cylinder acted as a microphone. When the ambassador spoke, the sound waves of his voice would vibrate the membrane. This vibration would alter the capacity of the circuit, modulating the radio wave that was bouncing back to the Soviet receiver. Essentially, the device was a mirror for radio waves. But instead of reflecting light, it reflected the sound of the ambassador's voice. As soon as the Soviets turned off their radio beam, the device went back to sleep. It became just a piece of metal inside a piece of wood. Untraceable. Invisible. For 7 years, the Americans had no idea. Ambassador Harriman loved the seal. He was proud of it. He once even commented that the British tried to find a bug in it and failed. The arrogance of the Americans played right into Stalin's hands. The breach of security was catastrophic. Imagine the conversations that took place in that study between 1945 and 1952. The Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe, the formation of NATO, the Berlin airlift. The Soviets knew the American position on every major issue before the negotiations even started. They knew when the Americans were bluffing. They knew when the Americans were afraid. It wasn't until 1951 and 52 that the Americans began to suspect something was wrong. British and American radio operators monitoring Soviet traffic started picking up the ambassador's voice on open airwaves. It was a ghost signal. They could hear Ambassador George Kennan dictating a memo, but they couldn't find the transmitter. The State Department sent security teams to Moscow. They tore the embassy apart. They ripped up floorboards. They drilled into the plaster. They found nothing. The thing was passive, so when the sweepers were working, the Soviets simply turned off the external beam. The bug disappeared. The breakthrough came by accident, or perhaps by a stroke of luck in the timing. In September 1952, a technician was sweeping the room with a standard signal generator. By chance, he happened to tune his equipment to the exact frequency that the device was tuned to at the exact moment the Soviets were activating it. He heard a feedback screech. He followed the signal. It led him straight to the wall above the ambassador's desk. He looked up at the Great Seal. Ambassador Kennan was in the room. He later described the moment. The technician took the heavy wooden carving down from the wall. They carried it into a secure room. They began to dismantle it. Inside, hidden in a hollowed-out cavity behind the eagle's beak, they found it. A small, silver cylinder with a thin wire antenna. It looked like a tadpole. Kennan recalled feeling a mixture of horror and admiration. It was unfathomably simple, he said. There were no batteries to replace. It could have lasted forever. But the discovery of the Great Seal bug didn't end the story. In true Cold War fashion, the United States government decided to keep it a secret. They didn't storm the Kremlin. They didn't expel the Soviet diplomats. They wanted to study the device. They shipped it back to Washington, to the FBI and the CIA labs. The American engineers were baffled. They had never seen anything like it. They spent months trying to understand the physics of how it worked. They even named it the Thing, because they couldn't classify it. It revolutionized the understanding of surveillance technology. It taught the CIA that anything could be a bug, a chair, a lamp, a piece of art. For 8 years, the Great Seal bug sat in a classified vault. It was a shameful secret of American incompetence. Then came 1960, the U-2 incident. On May 1st, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. The United States was caught red-handed spying on Russia. President Eisenhower had denied the flights, but the Soviets produced the pilot and the wreckage. It was a massive diplomatic humiliation for the U.S. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was furious. He demanded an apology. He cancelled a peace summit in Paris. At the United Nations in New York, the Soviets launched a propaganda attack, accusing the United States of being a treacherous aggressor that violated international law and spied on sovereign nations. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., needed a counterpunch. He needed to prove that the Soviets were just as guilty of espionage. He needed a prop. On May 26, 1960, inside the UN Security Council chamber, Henry Cabot Lodge unveiled the secret. He placed the Great Seal on the table in front of the world's cameras. He opened it up. He showed the tiny silver cylinder. "Here is the proof," Lodge declared. "This device was hanging in the office of the American ambassador in Moscow for years. It was given to us as a gesture of friendship by the Soviet Union, and all the while it was betraying us. The theater was effective. It showed the world the cynicism of Soviet diplomacy. Using school children to plant a bug, it was a PR disaster for Moscow. But for the intelligence community, the Great Seal bug is more than just a historical anecdote. It represents a turning point in the philosophy of spycraft. Before The Thing, espionage was about people. It was about recruiting agents, stealing papers, photographing maps. After The Thing, espionage became a battle of technology. It became a war of invisible waves, of electronic countermeasures, of encryption and frequency hopping. Leon Theremin's invention was the grandfather of modern RFID technology. The same technology that is in your credit card, your passport, and the toll pass in your car, passive chips that wake up when scanned by a radio beam, traces its lineage back to that wooden eagle in Spaso House. The Soviets continued to use this passive technology for decades. In the 1970s and 80s, the US discovered that the structural steel beams of the new US Embassy building in Moscow were packed with similar passive resonators. The entire building was essentially one giant microphone. The US eventually had to abandon the construction of the top floors and rebuild them completely with secure materials. The Great Seal bug teaches us a lesson that is terrifyingly relevant today. We surround ourselves with smart devices: phones, televisions, speakers, thermostats. They are plugged in. They are connected. We assume they are secure. But just like Ambassador Harriman in 1945, we invite these devices into our private sanctuaries. We hang them on our walls. We put them on our desks. And we assume that because we don't see a wire, or because the light is off, that nobody is listening. But silence does not mean privacy. The genius of The Thing was that it used the environment itself to spy. It used the energy from the outside to violate the inside. Today, hackers can turn your own phone's gyroscope into a microphone. They can use the vibrations of a light bulb to record speech. The methods have changed, but the principle remains the same. The most dangerous spy is the one you invite into your home. Ambassador George Kennan, years later, reflected on the incident. He said it taught him that in the world of espionage, there is no such thing as a sanctuary. There is only the illusion of safety. The eagle on the wall looked like a protector, but it was a parasite. The Great Seal bug now resides in the National Cryptologic Museum in Maryland. It sits behind glass, silent and inert. The wood is aged. The silver cylinder is tarnished. But if you stand in front of it and speak, the membrane still vibrates. It is still listening. It is waiting for a beam that will never come again. But other beams are searching. Other devices are waking up. The Shadow War has moved from wooden carvings to silicon chips, but the goal is the same: to hear the secrets you whisper when you think you are alone. This concludes the file on the Great Seal bug. We have seen the weapons, the traitors, and the bugs. But sometimes the CIA doesn't just listen. Sometimes they have to go out and steal something massive, something impossible. Next time, we return to the Black Ops. We are going to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. We are going to declassify the most expensive, most audacious, and most bizarre heist in the history of the CIA. A mission to build a giant claw, hide it inside a fake mining ship, and lift a sunken Soviet nuclear submarine from 3 miles deep.